Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our early Paradox Rift tier list. We've only just begun to test some of these things in PTCG Live, and we also have a ton of information rattling around right now. We've been trying to track down the early results of the Play Limitless tournaments, as well as the early Japan City League results, so there's a lot of stuff to figure out. We're coming off what was one of the most wide and interesting and kind of ever-changing meta from the previous 151 format, and there's some potentially really powerful new contenders from Paradox Rift, which go into new decks, but also formulate new decks on their own. So it feels like there's still so much to explore, even though we've put a decent amount of time into this. So do bear with us. We're trying to rationalize a lot of things, and as always with these sorts of tier lists, if certain decks pipe up and become, a certain threshold of play rates in a tournament, it completely changes what's good in a room. But this is really our early take on the Rift meta.
Yeah, definitely. That was the one thing I wanted to say. This is an early analysis. Basically, realistically, there were like 10 decks that we were all aware of in the previous format, and I think on a good day, any of those 10 could have actually taken down a tournament. And whilst things definitely, I don't think things expand too much, there are some really, really powerful cards, and I still think we're going to be in this format where when we have the top 10 video towards the end of this week, any of those 10 decks realistically could still be a very, very good call and even win a tournament on the right day. So super wide format, then a set being released with such impactful cards makes for, I think, what's been a really, really interesting sort of progression of the format that we've seen over in Japan. And I think it's going to make it a really unique format, at least for this first month or so, that you could have 2 or 3 weeks of tournaments back to back to back where decks or where the top eight is completely different. So yeah, it's going to be really, really interesting. To kick things off though, we are going to kind of be in familiar territory with some of the decks that we've already been talking about as that have been some of the best ones. And I'm going to kick things off with Gardevoir. I still think Gardevoir is up there in that A tier. I think it was always pretty solidly in that top three of the previous format. I still think on paper it is the strongest 60 cards in a deck. Regardless, I think some of the things you can do with Gardevoir are absolutely insane. Some of the things that you need to worry about, things like the I Am Valiant, the Iron Hands, things like Sableye, some of those are kind of addressed here and there. There's obviously different sort of mindsets and thoughts about how to play Gardevoir at the moment. Joe and I are still a big fan of the evolution package and Arven and the Evo TM, but I'm still not 100% sure whether that's the best way. I still think there's a lot of room to work that out. There's the question of do you play Jirachi, don't you play Jirachi? There's the question of there was still previous questions from old lists about do you play Mew, do you not play Mew, do you, there's lots of different things. There's Screamtail, there's lots of single additions to this kind of to this archetype that I think still keep it quite interesting. Still think it's up there as one of the best, and I still think you're gonna be able to get out of a lot of games just by drawing a lot of cards. Curlier, like being able to Curlier way more consistently with the Arven Evo TM package is actually really nice. It turns it into kind of like a pseudo stage one deck rather than a stage two deck. Admittedly, you're like going second, and you're giving up necessarily the going first initiative, but you're then way less reliant on candy, and you can start the turn by trading a couple of times or refining sorry a couple of times, and then just looking at your hand and seeing where you can go from there, rather than having to find all of those curlies in the first place. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think it also opens up the debate of whether to go first or second with Guardi as well, which is I think a good position to be in for a deck like this, because being able to play forced to go first or second, having a play into that with Mirage Step or Evo TM is going to be really good. So yeah, I can't rave enough about Gardevoir. I think there are still things to be concerned about. Iron Hands is still a bit of an issue for more traditional builds. It forces a lot more out of you if you're dealing with an Iron Hands early. I think that's again where the TM build is slightly better, because you already have your Curliers. So theoretically, it should be a little bit easier to be able to get to like a Shining Arcana Guardi and a Reversal, and try and at least take a bit of a response KO. Whereas with the traditional build, you're still going to need to maybe find double candy, or maybe have to discard a lot of energy and really go for like an early Zacian play just to respond on them, which obviously then leads to another two prize KO and this kind of stuff. So I think that deals with the Iron Hands build a little bit better. I think Jirachi is in and out. There's been, as we talk about Losso, and there's been an interesting sort of shift with Lost Zone as to the kind of Lost Zone builds that are seeing play. So I still think it's definitely one that is up for debate, but I think it's going to be one of these cards, a bit like old Tina promo and stuff like that, where it's in and out depending on the meta. Anytime it's out, it's going to be great because it gives you an extra sort of ball search card or anything like that, which is brilliant. I think in traditional, it's probably a little bit better, whereas the Arvin build does sacrifice a little bit of space to try and find the turn one TM combo, which is important. So it may not be as popular in there. And then finally, I think Valiant is still a bit of an issue for you. There's a lot of low HP basics in the deck, but also you're self-damaging to try and deal with the Valiants, which obviously then can lead to multi-prize KOs on their turn. But Iron Valiant hasn't seemed to have found a perfect partner yet. Now, I think we might see one emerging in the next couple of weeks, because I still think the card is inherently incredibly powerful. But right now, it's actually not kind of the biggest concern in my mind for Gardevoir. So yeah, a couple of things to keep in mind. Some of the things that you may have to worry about a little bit, but I still think Gardevoir is up there as probably the most powerful deck, at least in my mind, the strongest draw 60. And again, now it has multiple ways to play in the more traditional build or the new Arvin Evo TM build. There's kind of that question as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, just a couple more things. I obviously think Countercatch is a big card, opens up so many lines of play, and I'm kind of warming up to Screamtail a little bit. I think just because you can combine it with Iono Countercatcher, you can make those stalling plays similar to Lost Tina, actually, where they have Sableye. You can do some weird things with the Cress and with Screamtail with those combinations where you can put someone on a low hand size, try and get a snipe prize or something, and catch back up. I think there's just so many mechanics that Guardy can take advantage of right now that puts it right back up in that mix. And Valiant is kind of possibly even underperforming what I initially expected, or we initially expected, just because it has polarized matchups and there are enough bad matchups in the game still that it may not be popular enough for Guardy to worry about. And even if it is popular, if it remains the rapid variant as one of the more popular ones, Guardy can simply make an EX and it can still have a game there. So yeah, we rate it pretty highly in the game right now. I'm going to talk about Chien-Pao Baxcalibur with the big introduction of that Iron Hands. We believe it remains an A tier deck, one of the top decks in the game. I think it was kind of climbing up that ladder to being almost squeaking into that sort of top 5 of the best decks in the previous format, but it feels like you just get a much cleaner 60 now with an Iron Hand sneaking in with 1/2 Lightning in that list. And there's a bit of a debate around that. There's also a debate around whether cross switches remain or whether we start seeing some space be made in order to have Boss's Orders plus Countercatcher, or just go, Gustless and just have ropes and switches and say that Chien-Pao plus Iron Hands covers almost everything in the game between the two of them, and you can always make something happen with those guys. Especially with the threat of Greninja as well, of course. It still forces certain board states of some of these evolving archetypes and other setup-based decks. You're essentially just what we were before, but with kind of more ironed out matchups, which is looking really solid. And I think it's still going to be somewhat of its worst enemy, where there are going to be these archetypes that ask a lot of questions. There's not a huge amount of Judge Path in the game right now. Feels like Roaring Moon is kind of pushing the Arc variants out a little bit. You'll notice it's not even as part of our tier list discussion today, even though I feel like an Arc pile could emerge at some point. And that's always that sort of wait and see archetype. It feels like it's only really like Miraidon and Tina that are going to be path-based decks right now. I think that's pretty good for you. It means you can be quite skimpy on your counts and just have those 4 Pokestop cycling through the deck. So it's kind of what we've seen before with an obvious upgrade, in that seeing Lightning Energy in the opening stages, seeing Vessel in the opening stages, just having extra space for ball search cards if you are making the cuts of cross switchers. You get less clogged with the barrel throughout the game, and you have better early game cards. Just seeing Energy is always good, right? Because it can allow you to pay retreat into Chien-Pao, or it can get you your early Greninja cards, that sort of thing. So I think you just get a much cleaner 60 than when you had to shove in cancelling Cologne as your win condition in so many matchups. It just seems like it's a more natural progression now for the archetype, and it does feel really strong to me. Quick note on Toedscruel, I think that is a tech card. We saw it in Japan in their Elite Four tournament or whatever it was as a tech inclusion. I think there is some fear factor of that card going into Charizard lists, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be a card that goes into all sorts of 60s, because not everything has space or the Evo TM to actually accommodate this sort of stage 1 package. And at the very least, Toedscruel only has 120 hit points, so if you can still Vessel and Chien-Pao out enough energy, you can still get through that Toedscruel for a couple prize cards and still be in the game as well.
Next up, I'm gonna take a look at Roaring Moon. I think that's kind of the one big new archetype that has pretty much taken the ladder by storm. I feel like every other game is against a Moon right now, and I think there's good reason for it. We definitely think it's an A tier deck. I think part of the success is down to how accessible it is. We always see this with new decks, like it's the early deck that you're given. So I think it's been very easy for people to pick up and play. But that doesn't mean its stats haven't been good. It still had a great win rate. It's been by far the most popular, which I think that is what leans into how accessible it is. I don't think that necessarily translates to its win rate. So its win rate being good, I think you have to take a kind of a separate statistic, which is why it does push itself into that A tier, along with obviously seeing a lot of success in Japanese tournaments as well to kind of back that up, which is really important. I think the deck is kind of in this pool of racing, like two prize racing decks, along with things like at the heart of it, Miraidon and Gholdengo. Obviously, Miraidon has a bit of leeway here and there and has some single prizes and ways to take multi-prize KOs, this, that, and the other. But at the heart of it, Miraidon is very much a two-prize racing deck, similarly to Roaring Moon. I think Roaring Moon has a little bit less depth than Miraidon, has a few less attackers. I think the Morpeko and the Brute Bonnet are both brilliant, and I think one of each is kind of pretty optimal. I've tried with and without both of those, and I think they both serve enough purposes in their own right to play both of them, which is important. But yeah, at the heart of it, it's still a racing two prize deck, but it doesn't have this damage cap that some of these racing two prize decks have, or it doesn't need multiple cards or whatever. It's just a 3 energy, take two prizes, turn after turn after turn, try and win the game in 4, 5, 6 turns, and just have quick games that you don't necessarily do anything flashy, but you do it as consistently as possible. And because of that, I think that's why it's deserving of that A tier. I think there's still some debate about how to play it. You've got like the Moltres E-Switch builds, which I'm personally a fan of, and that's the way I've found, or the way I've been the most successful with it. I haven't played too much of the Turbo build online, but that's because we played a lot of it when we did our testing weekend a couple of weeks ago. So I've since moved over to the Moltres build, and I think I'm preferring the Moltres build now. So I think that's a key inclusion, but I still think the Turbo build is great, and I still think we've kind of discussed that still playing E-Switch in the Turbo build makes sense and can maybe unlock some of those clunky hands that we had back a couple of weeks ago when we were first testing Roaring Moon. So I still think that's good. There's also kind of this question mark about Lost Zone Roaring Moon, which kind of doesn't really fit on this tier list because there's not been enough. We haven't seen enough of it for it to be its separate category, and so because of that, kind of lump it somewhere in between Roaring Moon and the Lost Zone box that we'll display later. But it's kind of still a question. I was really cold on this deck to begin with, but after having some chats, it actually feels like it could be something there. It's one of the best, if not the best, two prize attacker right now. And it's actually the deck is actually a lot more similar to Lost Tina than Turbo Lost Box, and but you're a basic instead of like a stage one in Tina. So that actually made me come around to the idea a little bit more, and it's going to be something that I definitely try out a little bit more. But I can't give too much authority on that. I think it's definitely something there though. Just being able to have like take a KO switch at any point is really interesting. There's a lot going on with Roaring Moon, but I think the success is warranted. I think the deck is a bit linear and a bit 1D. I think the second you see a Roaring Moon or a Brute Bonnet or whatever when your opponent turns over, you're kind of going to have an idea immediately of what the next 3 or 4 turns are going to play out like, and it's just whether you can respond to that against a Roaring Moon. But that doesn't mean the deck's bad. I still think it does, like the things that it's actually doing, the fact that it can just take a KO on anything, the fact that it has multiple ways of dealing with one prizes is really important. And there's lots of ways of being able to actually weave other things in, like MuEX and the Morpeko and stuff, to make these one prize matchups where you're not able to go 2-2-2 a little bit more manageable, which is nice. So yeah, I'm really impressed by Roaring Moon. Whilst I do think it's a little bit linear and a little bit 1D, I think the inherent power behind the deck makes it very, very strong. And I think it's also probably going to be one of the most popular decks going into LAIC, just because it will have been what a lot of people have tested, and it's very low to the ground and just does what it's meant to do, and you don't have to worry too much about getting overly complicating anything. I think it's a very, very solid tier 1 deck that a lot of people will pick up just to try and get some points. So if you're not fussed about playing it, I think it's definitely a great one to test against, because it could definitely be quite a popular one.
I'm going to talk about Lugia, another archetype that can take full advantage of that Iron Hands EX. Feels like the Vessel Lugia is kind of overtaking the single strike list, which hasn't really gained a card in like 3 sets. Whereas we now have this plethora of attackers with the basic fire energy, the basic lightning energy to help with Iron Hands, and Luminous coming in, which means that possibly even like Luminion can attack and get its way off the board if you can turn attach basic energy and such. So there's some funny stuff going on in there. We're going to put it in the B tier. We still know the engine is rough. Lugia still has those headaches, and even though Vessel's a good discard card for the Archeops, I feel like you'd have just even more kind of clunk going in the list, where you have even more floating energy that you can't really research away at times. You have some Pokemon you can't really get rid of here and there. I think there are challenges for this archetype. That said, obviously gaining that Iron Hands gives you a lot of percentage into Charizard, into Gardy as well, which I think is genuinely pretty big. And also, Radiant Charizard, we were discussing it earlier. We think it's basically like a cheat code one prize attacker right now. The card is so incredibly strong with so many basic EXs and V Pokemon running around. With Roaring Moon, with Chien-Pao, with Miraidon, all these things, it feels like having that easy one prize swing attacker is so huge, and Lugia can take really good advantage of that. It still has Snorlax as well, which is actually one of the only like valid single prizes left in the game as well, because it stays out of Iron Hand's range naturally, which is just nuts. So you can actually represent an early one prize Mon and it not be an issue when you're up against the Hands decks. So the strengths of Lugia is that you're just shoving in every great attacker in the game and having that acceleration. The issues is that there are more aggressive racing decks and like Roaring Moon out there now that can still just get too far ahead of you. There's also other, obviously, Iron Hands in other people's lists, which is a concern for Lugia. Obviously, an Archeops going down for 2 prizes isn't great, but there are situations where Lugia can even go down and such, so especially just Lugia V for 3 prizes or Luminion for 3 prizes. These are horrific. There are equally challenges for Lugia, and we know that its opening turns are shaky, so you can't really respond to what your opponent has. You're kind of at their mercy when you're facing the Chien-Pao matchups and the Roaring Moons. If they just come out the blocks quickly, you can just get bullied off the board, and I think that's why we're going to put it a little bit lower, despite the deck gaining some really good new attackers.
Let's take a look at Snorlax Stall, because this is a really interesting one. I feel like we haven't had too much in the way of control for a little while, but it basically, we found that Counter Catcher basically completely unlocks the deck in terms of it actually being like arguably top 10 or just outside the top 10 of decks right now. We kind of mentioned this in the set review, but we've kind of reached this point where there is just a critical mass of controlling cards that means if you put 60 of them in a deck, you're going to be able to out-resource some matchups. And I think right now there's actually a lot of matchups you can out-resource. With things like Erica's Invitation, Counter Catcher, there's lots and lots of ways of gusting now and kind of trying to slow things down. It feels like people aren't really respecting control still at the moment, even after it won one of the bigger online tournaments as well. So we might start to see some respect for it now and some text here and there go into lists. But I feel like we say, we've reached this critical mass of cards, and I think Counter Catcher was the one that kind of unlocked it all. I still think there's issues against some of the decks in the format. There's still going to be decks that play a boatload of switch items, kind of, or one of the biggest things holding back control, I felt, in previous formats has actually been how much Lost Zone there's been, because they run so many switch outs, and even with Misfortune Sisters, they often get over the line and are able to take 6 prizes on you, especially when they have efficient attackers like Sableye and stuff and Cram, and they don't need energy and things like that. So I feel like there's still that kind of question mark. And there's also a lot of decks there's also situations that we now have a few decks that can actually try and take very, very quick wins on you. The fact we have things like Turbo Roaring Moon, whilst that's a deck that has a lot of switch cards, not many switch cards and stuff, and a lot of heavy things to retreat or try and trap up before you get to Snorlax, and then you can start Snorlaxing away their 3 switch cards at most. The turbo aspect of Roaring Moon, which can just try and win out the gate quite quickly or try and push you out of the game quite quickly, because you're not really able to punish them from taking quick prizes with Roaring Moon and that kind of stuff. So it's definitely, I feel like Control's in a really interesting position. I think it's probably just outside the top 10, maybe looking in at that 10th position when we start to properly rank the decks in that B tier, and it still feels like it's in that B tier. But there's definitely, like I say, a lot of cards right now that you can put into a deck, and a lot of like one-off supporters and a lot of gusting options and things like that. And whilst people aren't respecting those kinds of things, I think Snorlax is definitely in a really, really good position. The fact it's won a tournament online might be enough for people to have it on their mind going into, say, LAIC and maybe Gdansk as well, that it's maybe not as strong of a pick as it would have been had it not had like a win and had some early success. But I think the fact that it's had this success early enough already means that we're going to be in this format where, similarly to like the Jirachi that I mentioned earlier on, people are either going to tech for it or not, and you just kind of have to ride that wave. And if you're riding the wave at the right time, it feels like, again, there's a lot of tools right now that you're able to really put into a deck to try and punish a lot of decks that don't respect you. So yeah, it's really interesting. I'm not convinced that we're back in a state of like YouTube v Union or Pidgeot or anything like that, where it's a really big part of the format that you need to always have your eye on. But I think there's enough now for it to be picked up by more than just Sander and the other control experts out there. It's actually a deck that could be picked up by a considerable minority of people that you might actually have to start thinking about it, and you might expect to see one at some point during a day one or something like that. So yeah, it's not really gained all that much other than counter catcher, but it just feels like people aren't respecting it, and that's enough with all of the other random little bits of control stuff that we've had over the past 6 months that you're now actually able to play a pretty viable control deck and try and out resource a lot of things.
I'm going to touch on Miraidon, another hands user. You can see I've got a theme with my opening picks here. I feel like it's not necessarily the best hands user in the game, but I feel like it's such an easy throw one copy in, maybe throw in Raihan, maybe EXP Shen, maybe one copy of Double Turbo, and suddenly you flip-flop some pretty awkward Lost Zone matchups in the past where you're going to feel much better into these Lost boxes just by having a lot of pressure at your disposal. You have high roll moments. At the end of the day, cashing in on those is great for a deck like this where you get to play best of threes, and if you just high roll on one of those, you're immediately a game up in a best of three, and it's actually pretty huge because there's also like brick equity and stuff that you can get with this deck because you play the game so much more than most other decks right now, which is huge. I also think this is probably the best Judge Parther in the game, which means there's always going to be some element of reason to play this archetype. I think the headache becomes Roaring Moon. I actually feel like this is a matchup where you should be going first to try and jam early path against them, because it feels like at the moment the Roaring Moons are all very ability focused. They're all looking to use Squawk, Luminion, like Jack said, sometimes the Galarian Moltres, these sorts of combos, obviously Greninja as well for unlocking their hand because they're very combo orientated. If you just jam a path early on them after tandeming out your chaps, they can really struggle to get anything going in the opening stages. So I think that's one of your best chances. If they do get into the game, the Ancient Booster Capsule is hell for you, but they will have other Pokemon around their board, so playing Counter Catcher or Boss in your list, obviously you play Arven, so you can cherry pick Counter Catcher as a one-of, and playing a Lost Vacuum I think is really valid in Miraidon right now to help out against opposing paths, because obviously Tina's a threat as well in the game right now. But to get rid of Ancient Booster Capsules and possibly even Bravery Charm if the Mirror's going to be popular, I think these are pretty big deals. But Miraidon still seems to be very consistent at what it's doing, but is one of the better aggro decks that can play Path itself. So it's pretty happy seeing more Chien-Pao around. More Roaring Moon is like fine, I think, and there's still enough of these like other stage 2 decks that can crumble to Judge Path that I feel like it's still a valid racing deck. It's kind of in the shadow of Roaring Moon right now. I think it's just kind of the new toy and is obviously very powerful as well, which is a concern, but I think many Roaring Moons might actually go second into a blind field in a best of 3 because they want to just aggro attack. And I've been thinking a lot about go first, go second with a lot of these archetypes. And I think Miraidon's one of the best at playing both sides of that coin because it has that path cheese option against so many turbo decks that are kind of popping up right now. But I still feel like it's really valid, and Iron Hands kind of secures or helps possibly Guardian Lost Zone enough, and also gives you just backdoor avenues to win games when your opponent's trying to skew a prize map in the later stages. I think it's fine, because the secret about Miraidon is it's actually a setup deck, and when you get double Flaffy developed into matchups that aren't playing Greninja, it's actually really, really strong. So yeah, I think the archetype still has legs. It's kind of dropping a little bit, but wouldn't surprise me if it stays around and is still going to be valid for sure.
Let's talk about one of the better ways to counter Iron Hands in Lost Box Charizard. I think that's been one of the more surprising ones for me in how it's done in early results. We're actually putting it all the way up in the A tier. Now, I will preface this with Joe and I are huge fans of this deck regardless, but it actually feels like Joe said earlier on that Radiant Zard right now is a brilliant card in this format. It responds to Iron Hands really, really well, but it also responds to basically any like early 2 prizer really well. You're not worried about, like, you're able to play things like right hand DTE to try and set this up quickly and take a surprise to 2 prizes and then still get the value out of the ability later on in the game with super odds and stuff, which is really important. But you also still have all of the old sort of tools that the deck used to play in like heavy Sableye, and still being able to race other 1 prize decks with efficient attacks from Cram as well. So yeah, it feels like it's in a really good spot, and I think it's a great time to be playing Radiant Charizard. I think there's still a bit of a question, like I mentioned earlier on, when talking about Gardevoir, about how many people are playing things like the Jirachi to counter Sableye, which is I think is something to keep in mind. But you'll see that this has been separated out from the Lost Zone box, kind of like the turbo builds, and it's really been overperformed or outperforming those. Maybe like overperforming for what we initially expected, but it still seems like a really solid way of being able to counter some of these very powerful 2 prize Pokemon with a 1 prize still being able to play a 1 prize archetype and not being too worried about some of these things that are trying to grinch you at the moment, which is really important. I still think there's somewhere for Turbo Lost Box, which we'll kind of talk about when we talk about Turbo Lost Box separately. But this has always felt to me it's a little bit more honest. I guess it's kind of doing unfair things in a different way. It's not trying to go for this super combo oriented turn 1 Mirage Gate, but instead you've just got an insanely efficient attacker. And right now, like looking at our A tier, and especially when we get to the end of the A tier and towards the end of the video, there's a lot of matchups that Charizard is just really good into at the moment. It's really good at dealing with multiple 2 prizes, and when we have various decks that are just trying to be like 2 prizey racing decks, that's a great position to be in because you have all of the usual Lost Box stuff that we've seen has bullied out other 1 prize decks for so long. So being able to have this combination once again feels very powerful. Again, for me, it's a bit surprising as to how popular and how successful it's been, but it's been like the 3rd most successful deck in terms of like awarded CP, what the equivalent of CP would be with these online tournaments, which is pretty crazy given that it feels like there hasn't been too much about this deck for a little while. So yeah, very solid archetype. I don't think it's quite the best Lost Zone variant. I still think Giratina holds that mantle for now, but I do think for now it also is a little bit better than the Turbo build, whilst Turbo still kind of works out how it navigates around this format, what attackers it needs, that kind of stuff. How many people are actually playing Sableye and stuff, and you're very sort of all in on that kind of thing, and how you deal with Iron Hands, all of this kind of stuff. Charizard doesn't have to worry about any of that because you don't have that much flexibility with the deck, but you just have a really solid 60 cards. So yeah, it might be a bit of a surprise to be in that A tier, and it is going to be, as you see towards the end, it is going to be towards the bottom of that A tier. But we do really feel like Radiant Charizard alone is just such a strong card in the format that once again Sablezard could be one of the best ways of playing Lost Box.
Yeah, and the combo actually surprised me in that many of the Iron Hands decks aren't going to combine it with like an Iono or anything like that because it's the likes of Lugia, the likes of Chien-Pao that plays like a low count of these sorts of cards, but it's not really their opening strategy. So if you line up a Raihan, it's really easy to actually get that response, which just seems so vital right now. So it seems to be well placed just based on how decks are currently shaping up. But yeah, definitely a sort of wait and see one. Jack touched on Giratina Lost Box. We are once again believers of the archetype. It's got a ton of results to back it up right now. It's the best performing deck in Japan. And as we know, Japan have been loving this deck the entire time, where there's been more cynicism and skepticism over in the West. But in the online spaces, in the opening week or so, Tina has continued to do pretty well. And Countercatcher feels like that big buff. This deck already is really decent at playing from behind with Abyss Seeking and just sacking Comfey in the opening stages. With Path Rocks, Path Iono, now with Countercatcher, man, you can come back from all sorts of strange board states and prize deficits because you can pick apart tons of engine Pokemon with Sableye. Countercatcher can obviously bring up Jirachi as well, so you can just knock that out with Cram or the Sableye itself. Even if you are wasting damage, it's a 1-for-1, and then you open up your board space again. But it means you can take out these engine Pokemon on the bench whilst you trap something else in the active position with Sableye. Tina's damage output is obviously still not to be scoffed at, still fantastic to have that delete button for Charizard, for Guardy, that sort of thing. Even for Roaring Moon, which is huge, 290 is a huge threshold to get through as well. So yeah, the archetype seems great in that it balances pretty good consistency and aggression when it needs to, alongside having just every combat card imaginable in the game, that it's actually kind of like the biggest disruptor. So the game really just begins against Tina once you've taken the first like 3-4 prizes, and then they're going to make it a real scrappy slog to take those 1 or 2 at the end, and it's really playing those percentages of what you can draw from those like 1 or 2 cards, no on-board draw because it's been taken out by Sableye, that sort of thing. And it's going to make the game messy for you, but it's typically a really good strategy to win out a ton of games. I think there is a big difference in Japan and the West in that time is a bigger factor for us, which makes Tina a less appealing play, right? Because when you're trying to play these percentages and getting games down to the nitty gritty and not allowing yourself to scoop early, I think that does hurt us in a best of 3, which is possibly why there is the cynicism. Time is that trap for Tina, possibly for Gardevoir as well, that some of these other A-tier decks don't have to worry about so much. So I do want to give it that caveat that you know what you're getting yourself in for when you're playing Tina, and it may end up being a better best of 1 than best of 3 deck overall. But in terms of what the deck can actually do now, in terms of the wide matchup spread, it seems like it has answers to pretty much everything, and your opponent always has to pretty much get lucky to get out of your combinations if you can make them come together quite nicely.
Let's take a look at Gholdengo. It's a deck that Joe and I really enjoyed playing in the sort of week of early testing we did. Unfortunately, we're going to put it down in that C tier, but I think this is with a bit of a caveat. At the moment, all of the Gholdengo lists that have been doing well have been sort of Sizzle based, and whilst we didn't have as much time with the Sizzle build as we did with the Irida build and like Bastion Legion and stuff, I really did prefer, or we both really did prefer, the Irida Bastion Legion kind of package. And the fact that the deck is still doing well with this sizzle package, I think to me says that the concept behind the deck is really, really solid, and people just haven't really necessarily tried out some of the other ways of playing it, and instead have just sort of adopted some of the more traditional ways that we've seen basically from Japan. Joe raised a really good point earlier on in that Gholdengo stuff, or the successful Gholdengo builds, were all released a month before all of the Paradox build because they all came out of Raging Surf, which means no one's really necessarily adapted them to Paradox. And because of that, there's still potentially that mindset, or that the situation where people are still picking up on those lists rather than necessarily trying some of the new Paradox things like the Evolution TM and anything like that. So the fact that the deck is still doing well right now in what I personally think is a little bit of a less consistent build actually gives me a real ray of hope for Gholdengo, that it could at least push into that B tier at some point, once the format kind of settles down and people have had more time to tinker around with the deck. The other thing I think is really worth mentioning is it's still seeing a fair bit of success whilst people are massively investing time into Roaring Moon and Iron Valiant and Iron Hands. And I feel like Gholdengo has been forgotten about a little bit because of all of this shiny new Paradox stuff. But it could be that it actually is just trapped in the C tier because of awkward things like having really low HP basics and really being reliant on that Evolution TM, or having that turn of a lot of low HP basics out, which can then be punished by Iron Hands, by Iron Valiant, by early Sableyes, that kind of stuff, which is a bit awkward. As well as really potentially folding to like Iono Path and stuff like that. Now, we have mentioned it's not the biggest factor right now, but you can absolutely never write off kind of Iono Path or Roxanne Path or anything like that. Joe's already said it's probably best in Miraidon, but Giratina is still a path deck at the heart of things, I think. And it's just a path deck that can do some absurd things once it's gone down a few prizes, especially with that counter catcher like Joe mentions. So I still think there are a lot of questions that Gholdengo has to answer, and I think for that reason it's kind of still yet to climb out of that C tier, just because I don't necessarily know what all the best answers to those questions are. But like I say, I think the lists that are being played right now, I personally think they can still be worked on and improved, and it's just that people haven't really necessarily dedicated the time. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I feel like its matchups still seem okay. It was by far the most fun deck I had playing a couple of weeks ago when we were testing. It felt like a brilliant racing deck. One prize matchups kind of cause issues here and there, and I think that's potentially why Scizor is being considered a bit more, because it deals with one prize and also can trade up into two prize matchups, as well as surviving Iron Hands, which is really important. So I can see why lists have been built the way they have and kind of been adopted from successful lists over in Japan. But I am still really interested in seeing whether this can actually become a relevant racing deck. I think there are still going to be issues, like I say, with some one prize matchups. But even then, like we've found the bulk of Gholdengo to still be pretty reliable in some of those matchups as well. Just having 260 HP and making your opponent go through 260 HP Pokemon can still sometimes be quite difficult for one prize matchups.
Yeah, the main thing for me is just the supporter lines feel so weird. Like, I obviously get the high worker count, but the high Avery just feels so weird compared to having either Arven or Irida, which are just so insanely powerful early game supporters for whichever build you're playing. Like, I still think this is a really good single prize attacker, and it's obvious why that's seeing play. But in Japan, it's pretty much down the middle between Basculegion and Scizor in terms of success. But it seems like everyone's just picked up Scizor and ran with it for Gholdengo so far. But there's genuine merits to having the Irida package, so I'd like to see a bit of a change there. Also, like Vessel and Letter, I think there's this hot debate on playing like quad Vessel, but I think it doesn't give you enough reach into specifically Charizard, but also like Roaring Moon with Ancient Booster Capsule as well. It feels like if you just fail to reach that early KO against some of these multi-prize decks, you just lose on the spot because you're just not winning a race from then on, and Gholdengo doesn't have those same comeback plays available to it. So yeah, I'd like to see some change-ups in the list. I think you're right, though. I think there's just like a little bit too much issues here and there where it's not just Path that you have to deal with, it's also Valiant that you have to deal with, and there's also the one prize matchups which can be a little bit shaky and this, that, and the other. So I get why it's down in the C tier, but I do think the lists could improve, which could allow this archetype to get a few spikes here and there. And it's definitely, I'm not going to bat an eyelid at anyone who actually brings Gholdengo to better tournaments. I'm going to jump onto Mew. This is a really interesting one because I've seen a lot of other tier lists and whatnot about where Mew should land. We're going to put it in the B tier right now. Essentially, our top archetypes that are starting to shape up that top tier. Obviously, we still think Charizard's good as well, but Charizard's an iffy matchup. Roaring Moon isn't ideal even with Meloetta as a single prize threat. It doesn't actually matter that much because 1-3-2 is still easily a Roaring Moon's like 3 attack prize map anyway, and they play enough single prizes that they can throw one into the active against a Fusion Mew, so they probably have to play like catcher builds. I've seen that sneak back into at least some of the online tournaments, which was one of its big power spikes, just, you know, a quad coin flip catcher one, and that just feels horrible in a multiple round tournaments, honestly, in best of threes and whatnot. It just doesn't feel that reliable. So there's enough like dark racy stuff which feels a little bit awkward. Chien-Pao can also be a little bit of a concern. And yeah, Gardevoir is also not that free for you. Yeah, I think Fusion Mew is still that consistent archetype. Again, would never really be too surprised if it makes a top 8 here or there. But it feels like its matchup spread isn't really that great. I think there was a time when I was thinking, oh, it's going to be bullying these like Valiant variants and stuff, and the Gholdengos and whatnot, and it could just be a better racing deck. But as we start to see more of the tried and trusted archetypes creep back up to the top end of our tier list right now, it means that Fusion Mew is kind of in the place that it was in the past, but gains a new awkward matchup, which is more or less how we feel about the archetype. So doesn't really gain too much. I experimented with Counts Catcher in the list, which I think is kind of okay. But other than that, I feel... Oh, and Churro. Churro is actually kind of interesting to help out against the Lost variants, but it's only a slight upgrade to Penny already, so it's more or less the same as what it was, and its matchup spread wasn't that great in the previous format. It mostly came down to who's teching what and when, and there was a small tug of war between like DTE Mew, so everyone cut Drapion to go Spiritomb, which opened the door for Fusion Mew. I feel like there could be a bit of that again, and I don't think Spiritomb's like all that high. I would really only expect like Tina to be playing it right now, the top archetypes, but I think it's still got enough just natural challenges in the game that it's not going to be a huge issue.
Let's take a look at Zorobox. It's unfortunately a deck that I feel like we both really enjoy, but it always takes a bit of a it always takes a bit of a hit on these tier lists, and it's still going to be down in that D tier. We often talk about it basically because it's like it feels like every set that gets released, everyone always says this is another card for Zoroark, and whilst it probably does get a card every set, it also feels like it gains 2 bad matchups every set. So it's like every time you add a card to the deck, you then have to worry about something else. Valiant hasn't really like popped off necessarily as much as we thought initially, primarily down to people not being 100% sure on how to or what the best way to play it is, to be honest. But that is still like a contributing factor, along with hands being able to theoretically trade against a lot of your stage ones. A lot of them, like you can play various stage ones that are outside of hands range, but again, it's all kind of awkward. You have to. It feels like there's even more things to dodge and weave. You do gain Jirachi, which is nice for dealing with Sableye, which obviously has been one of the big headaches for Zoroark, but I still don't feel like that's enough for it to be invested in, because there's still more awkward things to have to deal with. A lot of the ways that Zoroark tries to win, it feels like it's or the more like viable archetypes there are in the format, the more random one-of attackers you have to include into your list, which makes the list all that more inconsistent. It feels like Zoroark really actually benefits from much narrower meta games, because it means that you actually get to cut some of the more niche attackers, and you get like additional ball search cards and stuff like that to be able to get into the game. So yeah, I still feel like it's a combination of being in a wide format and also gaining a couple of awkward, not necessarily awkward matchups, but a couple more cards that you really never want to be seeing in a couple of different decks. That means Zoroark is still kind of trapped in one of the lower tiers, which is unfortunate, because again, it's a bit of a fan favorite, and it's a really, really cool archetype. But I don't think the format necessarily serves it very well. And whilst you do gain a couple of cards here and there, like I say, it feels like every set you then have another headache to deal with in terms of another matchup or another card or whatever. So yeah, it's a bit of an awkward one, and it's a shame to still see it down here, but unfortunately, it's where it's going to stay for now.
I'm going to round out A tier then. We think there are 6 decks sort of vying for contention, all having, like a couple dodgy matchups here and there, but being generally strong and safe picks. And I think Charizard EX lands in that category, where it's got decent fight into most of these other top matchups. I think Chien-Pao probably being the most awkward among them. But we have seen already the Toedscruel tech card from the Japan Elite Four list. And you can even throw the Toedscruel EX into that mix as well. I think a 1 Toedscruel plus 2 Cruel package, 1 EX, 1 regular, could actually cover your matchup into Roaring Moon, help out against Giratina somewhat as well, at least force them to have Path at times, and really helps out against Chien-Pao. You also gain a bit of help into Gholdengo, which is nice. By having this combination of cards, obviously the EX preventing effective attacks, you can also use Charizard to not only power itself up, but then you power up the Toad's Cruel EX as well, so it's safe from Roaring Moon just gusting it up and taking 2 prizes. That would kind of be alongside a TM Evolution package, where we've seen this actually really kick on in Japan. It's kind of becoming more popular than a Candy Pidgeot build, where we're seeing the Bibarel, multiple Charmeleon in the list, sometimes as high as 3 copies. And then I personally back the Toedscruel. I think how we're seeing the amount of play to Roaring Moon, possibly Chien-Pao going above that sort of 10% threshold in tournaments as well. I feel like that 1-1-1 package seems pretty reasonable, honestly, for a TM-based build. It's a little bit all-in on hitting that Arven on turn 2. Sometimes you need to Forest Seal Stone and get the TM, but we're seeing Arven plus Town Store to really give yourself good odds towards those sorts of plays, so that you can insta go into Bibarel plus Charmeleon. Sometimes there are decks that can pick apart that board state quite quickly, but there really aren't that many, especially if you get to TM as the player 2. So I think that's really, really solid, to be honest with you. And obviously Charizard's still that dumb, overstated card that's a huge issue for a number of archetypes, and I think it's going to be pretty okay. Overall in the formats, it feels consistent enough. By the way, the Arven build is still doing just fine, both in Japan and in our online tournaments. It still had a pretty decent handful of results, and it's proving that it's still in the mix, still a certainly powerful archetype. It's keeping Mew in check as well, partly as well, which I think is just going to be relevant, because it always seems like that can pop up at any given tournament. There are some people that just will back Mew to the hilt. So I think it's an important deck to keep in the formats, and I feel like with this cheeky Toedscruel package, it could genuinely, like, that card could end up just not seeing play at all in the archetype. But for me, based on our top 6 or 7 or so decks, it seems like a really valid use of 3 spaces to really help some matchups out. And if I was going to LAIC, I feel like Evo Zard is probably where I'd be landing with that cheeky package, because I feel like it covers some of the most hyped archetypes in the game right now. And yeah, I think it's a really solid one.
Let's take a look at the other Lost Zone box decks. This is kind of looking more towards Turbo Lost Box, but I guess also kind of keep in mind this is, I guess, talking a little bit about Kyogre, a little bit about that Moon Lost Box, all of the kind of other Lost Zone boxes for now. And we're actually going to put these in this kind of package of decks in the B tier, which I think is the lowest Lost Zone box has been in a little while, because it's been like Turbo has been head and shoulders basically the best deck for, or one of the best decks for the best part of like 6 months now, maybe even longer. So I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. I think there's the question of Iron Valiant, which has turned out to not be necessarily the biggest concern, but is still a question. There's the question of Iron Hands and how popular that's going to be, and I think the fact that Chien-Pao theoretically was on the cusp of being a top 5 deck pre this format. It was definitely very solidly a top 10 deck. Theoretically, gains hands is an issue because it probably pushes it into that top 5. And as you can see, we put it as the 5th best deck at the moment. There is still obviously a bit of maneuverability, but it's definitely going to be more popular, as well as other things potentially playing it on top. There's also dealing with Roaring Moon. Now, whilst Roaring Moon does sometimes have to deal damage to itself, and there's sort of awkward things about Roaring Moon. The fact that there are 2 prizers and stuff like that, they have a lot of ways of weaving in 1 prizers and not damaging themselves and stuff like that. And if they're able to like secure a tool on as well as like Iono or anything like that, if they're playing like a low count of Iono in the build as well towards the end of the game, it can be really difficult for you to deal with a bulky Roaring Moon. So I think there's a lot of questions that Lost Zone has to answer. And I think right now, because there's also the Jirachi question, right? Whether how many decks are actually going to play Jirachi, which I think will probably only be Charizard and some Gardevoir and probably a lot of Tinas. But I think it's not actually going to be in like everything. But that's enough for it to, again, pose a question. And I think right now that's enough questions for Lost Zone Box to need to basically go back to the drawing board just a little bit and work out exactly what it needs to be, what attackers it needs to be running, what kind of techs it needs to be playing, and this, that, and the other to kind of fully establish the kind of build it needs to be. Now, I actually have no doubt that we can probably see Lost Zone Box potentially creeping back up into that A tier eventually when the meta has settled down a bit and we have a better idea of exactly what attackers to abuse in this deck to try and take advantage of the format. But again, this is another kind of point about having a really wide meta at sort of the top, is you don't know necessarily what to try and counter. And that's kind of the position that Lost Zone Box is in at the moment. I think trying to work that question out and trying to work out what you need to add into your deck could be a really, really important one. It could still lead to Lost Zone being an incredibly powerful archetype. I think Turbo Lost Box, whilst it does have these questions to answer, is still inherently a very, very strong deck that can just push other decks out of the game on turn 1 potentially if it's going second. So yeah, there's definitely still inherent power behind it, and that's why it's still at the top of the B tier. I don't think you can ever really write it off, especially in a format where there's so much going on. People that have been playing Lost Zone for a long time that know how to sequence this deck really, really well and can get out of these awkward low Iono or Roxanne hands and still find wins, are still going to be in a really good position because it's still a very high risk, high reward, very high skill ceiling deck for people to play. So yeah, it feels like it's definitely one that can be unlocked. I think there's still a few more questions, and I don't think it's quite as broken as it's been in a little while. I think there's enough questions like the Jirachi and like some of the counters that we've seen to at least sort of rein it in a little bit down to that B tier. But I think with the right build and the right attackers and stuff, there's no reason to believe that Lost Zone's really going anywhere. I just think for now it's yet to be explored as to exactly what that build looks like.
Let's talk about some Valiant then. I'm going to start with the Entei Valiant. This one's popped up very recently in some online tournaments. And I think it's got some decent legs to it. Essentially, the idea is you sub out the like Rapid Strike energy from the Urshi list. You go to like 6 or so basic fire. You have Magma Basin as your stadium card. And that means that with like Jet Energy and the amount of switch cards that you have naturally in the deck list, you can get a turn 1 Entei attacking, which gives you a really good like tempo option into other 2 pricey matchups. But you still have the Valiant Yoga Loop part of the deck. Now, at the moment, we're tentatively putting it into the C tier. It's actually a really interesting one. Valiant could end up being like a really good deck in the mix at different times in the game. If we're going to see a very similar spread to last format, where we saw 10% around the board of Guardi, Lost Box, Chien-Pao, Charizard, these sorts of things, that would be amazing for Valiant builds, because there's so many matchups that are just good for you in a tournament that you could easily make that 6-2-1 record, make it into day 2, and see what's what in that second day of the competition. I feel like Valiant's going to struggle to convert ICs and regionals all the way into top 8s. They just have to hit a really magical run, because there are still the Mews, the Lugias, the Roaring Moons to be concerned about. I think the Entei build will probably have a better time into the likes of Mew Mew and Moon than the Urshi build will, and possibly into Gardevoir as well, because your main attacker isn't so vulnerable that they can just EX through you. They might have to just damage other things even more, and then that opens up other Yoga Loops down the line as well. So I think the Entei has a lot of validity. It gives you even more like fleet-footed combinations, this, that, and the other, to draw more cards. And like I said, it can... You're not going to lose if your opponent just leads like a chunky guy and you can't Yoga Loop them straight away. You have early aggressive tempo. So it's a really creative and clever deck list, I feel. Also, it gets to take advantage of one of my favorite cards at the moment, Radiant Charizard, as just a bomb, essentially, in that later stage. Again, really good against Roaring Moon and such, where you can just dance with Valiants, put things into range, and then finish them off with Radzard. It could be absolutely crazy. So still definitely on that sort of combo element of the game. Still going to struggle against, a Miraidon that just paths you, or a Tina that just paths you. Still going to struggle against Moon, I think, naturally, especially if you don't play like Lost Vacuums to get rid of Ancient boosters and stuff. But I feel like there's a really solid chance that this sees play if the format's wide. Now, what's super interesting is that Roaring Moon is so popular in the online tournaments. That's one of your weakest matchups. And it's just everywhere. At the moment, in these online events, you could easily hit 2 or 3 moons, right, in 8 rounds or whatever it is. So I think we're seeing quite bad stats for Valiant, but I do think in a tournament setting, it could easily be a deck that like gets a pretty nice day 2, actually, because it can Grinch so many archetypes, and it's pretty consistent at what it's trying to do, to be honest with you. So looking at that sort of top echelon of archetypes, there aren't many that you don't want to face. It's just that Moon and Tina, I would say, more than anything. But I think the Entei is a really valid option and a pretty decent alternative to Urshifu. There's kind of strengths to both of them, and it'll be, again, based on what you're trying to dodge and hit overall.
Yeah, and I'll take on the Urshifu build. Kind of take a lot of what's just been said, pretty much similarly, but I feel like the matchups are just way more polarizing. You're very, very much all in on trying to do sort of this multiple turn combo plays. You're much better into, or you're not much better because the Entei build is still good, but you're really, really good in some of these evolving decks, but you're probably even worse into things like Roaring Moon because you don't have the punch potential of an Entei to deal 200 or whatever, or you don't have the Radiant Charizard as a late game bomb. So kind of think about these. I feel like I think about these decks quite similarly, but the Iron Valiant Urshifu build is just a bit more polarizing. I still think it's a really good deck to kind of at least get some reps and experience within to kind of know what their reach is. And it's another deck that I think will very much depend on how spread out the early or the sort of the day one metas are, because again, you'd absolutely love to see some of these low HP basic decks because you will have an absolute field day, especially given that whereas the Entei build will just kind of end the second turn with hitting something in the active for a decent amount, you can actually just completely pick apart boards with the Urshifu build because you're able to Thornton into VMAX and try and take some snipes here and there as well. So again, feels like very polarizing decks, even more so the Urshifu build. I also agree that the Entei build probably has a little bit more of a solid mid to late game plan, also, as well as just having a bit more of a decent plan into some of these other 2 prize matchups where you're perhaps not getting as much value with the Valiant. So yeah, I'm really interested to see how these 2 decks kind of evolve in the meta and how the meta evolves for them to like you say weave themselves in, because it feels like there's potentially less emphasis on how these decks are going to impact the meta, and instead how the meta is going to impact how the meta evolves as to whether these decks actually just have tournaments where they're absolute breakout successes and then go back in the binder for a little while because all of a sudden people are respecting them again. So yeah, very, very volatile decks. Kind of interested to see where they go. And the Entei build is pretty new to me as well, so I'm pretty interested in trying that one out and seeing if that can shore up some of the issues about the kind of the fizzling that the Urshifu build does feel like it's a victim of sometimes.
And to round out the tier list, then I get to rag on Reggies. It's back. It's bad though. You get to play the Earthen Vessels and some basic energy, which means you're limiting yourself to only a handful of Reggies. I think fighting Metal Lightning are definitely good ones, and obviously Drago as well. So you need to play a handful of basic energy as well as like gifts and sometimes Luminous as well. It's still a lot to ask for, and the difference between Reggies now and Reggies in Silver Tempest is that like it was a really bad Lego deck that had insane matchups. If Reggie set up, it was beating like the Lugias, if it was beating the Mews at the time that were like the popular archetypes, and it was like good enough into Lost Box. And these are just not what's around right now. You have different matchups that you come up against. There's naturally like double collapsed in Gardevoir, which is like horrific for you. There's Chien-Pao using their Iron Hands, and yes, obviously you can try to play only 130 hit points Reggies, but then again, like you're giving yourself less good attacking mons in the deck, which is always awkward. They can always set up damage here, there, and everywhere as well. Roaring Moon is just a ridiculous hit point Pokemon that you're just not going to be able to race sufficiently. And on top of all this, you're just inconsistent. So it's back. Good for you, Reggie gamers. But it's garbage, I think.
So yeah, that's where we're at. Again, we kind of said at the start of the video, but this feels like a really early tier list just because of how much is introduced to an already wide meta. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to look back on this one. But we do feel like we've done a fairly decent amount of sort of early testing. That these feel like pretty solid early thoughts about where stuff falls. There's not, I guess there's not that much of a mix up in some ways, but also having a couple of really impactful cards and one very, very strong deck coming into the format has really changed things as well. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how LAIC plays out, and I think we're going to be in one of these formats where at least for the first month or so, you could have completely different results. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, you could have completely different results week after week after week because there's still so much to explore.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it because there's just so much versatility and diversity on the previous meta that we don't quite yet know where the tunnel vision is going to come in. Is there going to be a deck that sweeps up 20+% meta share that we've seen in previous formats? Or are we going to remain wide and just have even more additions and different tech cards and different variations of archetypes that we've already known? It could even flourish into an even more diverse format. So super interesting. Really can't wait to check out the stream and get playing in some cups and regionals as well, because we got this one for a decent chunk of tournaments in Europe as well as over in America and across the world. So seems like a really important format, a big change up to the game, which we have really needed, I think, even though 151 was super healthy. Yeah, so many questions I still have to ask, and every night I'm testing a different deck and feeling them out because there's just so much to experiment with. Let us know your thoughts down below. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and we'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.